In October 2017, the Institute for New Economic Thinking announces the formation of the Commission on Global Economic Transformation to find solutions to the big economic challenges of wealth inequality and impending mass unemployment resulting from rapid technological progress. These economic elites admit that the economic system is severely broken and the old ways won't fix it. And from the look in their eyes, you can tell that they think that if it's not fixed, angry mobs will wreak havoc and probably tear them all to shreds.
I think that this challenge is formidable, and yet most people that I talk to in government all around the world when I travel around are quite anxious right now. If you say to me, why is this situation present itself? Why do we have to create a commission right now? It's because people are quite fearful that the dysfunction of economies, particularly with regard to what I'll call social sustainability, but the ominous prospect of migration and climate change and their interaction, frightens people. Voters act like they are despairing, and probably with good reason. The effectiveness of government, where the domain of the sovereign is much smaller than the scope of the market, it's not even a matter of intent, it's a question of whether you can achieve that. But the biggest danger right now is whether this dysfunctional economics produces not the wisdom of crowds in democratic governments, but creates something that looks more like a raging mob and deforms the way we live. I'm talking about non-economic ways, freedoms and the way we treat each other, and essentially destroys the integrated economy that we have had. And I think whether you're on the left or the right, when you behind the scenes and you're talking to state leaders right now, they're scared. And they're scared of democracy, but they now understand by and large that democracy is a reflection of economic dysfunction at this point in time.
It's worth watching that bit again. Look at his face. He's not sure that he should have said that. He was being too truthful there. And you can see the fear.
They're scared. And they're scared of democracy, but they now understand by and large that democracy is a reflection of economic dysfunction at this point in time.
I think it's the two questions together, I think are very good ones. I think we went through a period of the sort of high point of a sort of hubristic belief that we had all the answers, the post-1990 end of history, fall of the Soviet Union. High point of sort of Washington consensus, in which it was believed by many economists that we simply had to have free movement of capital, free movement of trade, ideally free movement of people, and all would be the best in the best of all possible worlds. And seen from the top of the mountain at Davos, it all looked fine. But I think we know that all three of those propositions you need to think much more carefully about. Free movement of capital combined with total liberalization of finance is part of what led us to 2008 and to the economic shocks which are there. And we know from good economic theory that a lot of the propositions in terms of the benefits of competitive markets just do not apply well when you get to finance. They don't apply as well in relation to finance as they do in relation to other sectors of the economy. I think we know now, the work of David Autor and others in the US has illustrated, that the losers from trade globalization were bigger than we thought in the developed economies. I mean, you do first year undergraduate economics, it clearly tells you that free trade is capable of increasing the size of the total economic cake, but it also tells you clearly that it can only do that via movements in relative prices and wages, which must be to the disadvantage of one and disadvantage of the other. And there was a huge tendency before the crisis to say, well, yeah, that's true, but it's sort of at the margin, and it'll all come out in the wash over a period of time. But the evidence from the US that there are areas of the US which were particularly exposed to Chinese or Mexican competition, and that those where the real wages have fallen most dramatically, and those where the opioid abuse problem is greatest, and those which voted for Donald Trump in a large amount. This is a very, very compelling evidence now that you can't have this sort of wonderful, it'll all come out in the wash. And I would say, perhaps controversially, because a lot of people will agree with what I've said and now dislike what I've said, that you have to also ask questions about free movement of people as well. I don't see how you get a large free movement of people into a country and a large and sudden increase in the labour supply without expecting that that will have some impact on the equilibrium real wage rate of the people who are there at the moment. And I think, again, in the UK, before the Brexit vote, the sort of liberal elite was too sort of up here and sort of assuming there's absolutely nothing wrong with immigration. It's all fine. It'll all create benefits in the long term. But there were some distributional and transitional effects we didn't take account of. So we need an account of economics which is much more subtle and nuanced about this, and we need to legitimate the role of states and governments in managing these processes. Your point is, how do we do that in an environment where the reaction to some of these stresses is clearly not a sort of highbrow intellectual reaction where everybody sits down and analyzes the basic economic theory and works out what we do to manage it. It's a much more angry reaction, and it's an angry reaction that can take us in all sorts of radical directions. And you can get yourself quite depressed about the position that we've got to as a result of that. But I think, we in INET believe that if you simply keep working on problems with intellectual honesty and involving a lot of people, at least you can play some role in improving the quality of debate, which makes it more likely that we will find a way through these issues, and that some politicians and government leaders, or indeed business leaders, have the vision and the leadership to pick up those ideas. But it is a major challenge, because at the moment the predominant reactions to the downsides of globalization are a set of highly impassioned reactions, and including, I think, some completely perverse reactions, because I think it's absolutely true, as Joe says, that the election of Donald Trump, I think, is going to do absolutely nothing for the bits of the sort of American white working class which lost out from globalization and which therefore voted for Donald Trump. Indeed, I think the latest agenda of his tax reforms, which isn't a tax reform, it's just tax cuts for the rich, is simply going to extend the inequality yet further.
Yeah. Yes.
Our understanding of the economic model has changed. It's changed in a couple of ways. One, the 2008 crisis showed that financially led economic model, which was the model that predominated before 2008, didn't work very well. It didn't produce high growth, and it didn't produce stable growth. But it is still the predominant model. And so we need to understand why it didn't work better than we do, and what to do about it. Now, it's obviously much more of an Anglo-American problem than it is in some other countries, but America's a big part of the economy. The UK has been following that model, or at least England has been following that model, and so this represents another example. There's some really, final example, a really striking re-examination in the United States about not only the growth of inequality, but the change in factor shares. So the labor share is down, particularly if you exclude the top 1% of labor that's associated with finance and CEOs, and not really labor in the way we usually think about it. But the striking thing is the share of capital is also down. What does it mean, the share of capital and the share of labor is down. Well, share of ranks, monopoly ranks, all other sources of ranks are up. And that's a very different model of the economy than has been taught in basic economics for a very long time. And what are the sources of ranks, and how do we rethink how an economy that is so rent-driven and which is so far from the competitive model that Adam Smith talked about, although he was very aware of the presence of imperfections of competition, but it's become it was the dominant paradigm probably for 100 years. It's clear that there's going to have to be a rethinking not only of an understanding of how our economic system functions. All of these issues are actually interrelated. So I've listed them as separate issues, but they're actually interrelated, and the answers, the policy responses are going to be interrelated. And those will include a rethinking of the role of the state versus the market and civil society, rethinking some of the old models and trying to develop new models. So obviously in the short span of time of the Commission, we're not going to be able to develop all new theory. But the good news is that over the last 10 years, 15 years, large elements of an alternative model have been constructed. And so what we hope to do is to try to pull together these various strands and to create, you might say, a narrative or an understanding, and understanding what was wrong with the other narratives and why a lot of the conventional wisdom isn't wisdom anymore, and why we really need to rethink a lot of the paradigm and standard paradigm, and a lot of the policy answers that have been accepted in, not everywhere, but in large parts of the world.